All right, good morning. Here for another class, just us. But still good to be here. And sorry we missed last week, but here I got unexpectedly, but we are here now. So let me start with the parsha we'll talk about today, and then we will get to our topic for today. So firstly, this week's parsha is called Pinchas. Pinchas speaks about, the story starts in last week's parsha, where the Moabite and Midianite women attempt to seduce Jewish men and then get them to worship idols. There was a leader from the tribe of Shimon by the name of Zimri who came to Moshe with a Midianite woman asking, challenging Moshe, and then publicly cohabiting with this woman. And so Pinchas stood up and killed them both on the spot. And at the time there was a plague. Hashem was punishing the people for their worship of the idol and for their relations with the Midianite and Moabite women. And as a result of Pinchas' action, the plague stopped. And so Hashem tells Moshe that he's happy that Pinchas stopped what Pinchas did, and he's giving him his covenant of peace, and therefore, and he is making him as a Kohen. Although Pinchas was a grandson of Aaron, he had not become a Kohen since he had already been born at the time when Aaron had been made a Kohen. He and his sons had future grandchildren. Since Pinchas was already born at the time, he was not a Kohen yet, but he now becomes a Kohen. Then the Torah Hashem tells Moshe to count the people. They count the people. They had counted them 40 years earlier when they first left Egypt. Now they count them again. There's just a little less than there had been before, 601,000. Last time there had been 603,000. They count, and the Torah breaks down each tribe and by the various families of the tribes. Then after that, Hashem tells Moshe that these are the people to whom you are going to give. They're going to all enter the land of Israel. This is at the end of the 40 years in the desert. So this is the next generation. And you're going to give them the land. Each of these people are going to get a plot in the land of Israel. You will do it through a lottery, and where all the leaders of the tribes will join you in making the lottery to give the people the land. Moshe then turns to Hashem, and Hashem tells Moshe, you are going to die. You will not go into the promised land. Instead, you will not go into the promised land. Moshe turns to Hashem and asks Hashem, before that, when Moshe tells the people about the inheritance of the land, there are the daughters of Salafchad, who is a fellow from the tribe of Manasseh who had died in the desert, and he only had daughters, no sons. They come to Moshe and they say, our father had no sons, we are only girls, and if they were under the impression that only the sons can inherit, and therefore they thought they would not get a portion in the land, and their father's family would not get any portion in the land. And so Moshe reassures them that no, you will get a portion in the land, speaks to Hashem. He's not sure at first, but Hashem reassures him that yes, you will get a portion in the land. Then Moshe turns to Hashem and asks Hashem to appoint a leader to succeed him, and Hashem agrees and tells him to appoint Yehoshua, Joshua, his student. Then the rest of the parsha then goes through. Hashem tells Moshe about the laws of sacrifices, starting with the daily sacrifice, and then all the various Musaf additional sacrifices for Shabbat and the various festivals, and it goes through the entire year: Passover, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret, and gives us all the various sacrifices for the year. So that is the parsha. Then I should mention today is the 17th of Tammuz, which is the fast. It's a fast that we fast to commemorate 5 tragedies that happened to our people. Firstly, this is the day that the people worshiped the golden calf, and Moshe came down with the tablets and broke the tablets. Secondly, this is the day many, many years later when during the Hasmonean civil war in the Middle Second Temple period, where the temple itself was besieged, and there were defenders inside the temple, and there were no animals left for sacrifice, and as a result, the daily sacrifice stopped on this day. Furthermore, there was a Greek general by the name of Apostomus who burned a Torah scroll publicly on this day. And also, the Greeks put an idol in the temple on this day. And then finally, this is also the day that the walls of Jerusalem were breached before the destruction of the Second Temple, leading to a 3-week battle in the city before the temple was actually destroyed on the 9th of Av. So those are all the things that we mourn on this day. It's therefore a fast that starts in the morning and goes all the way till nightfall, about 8:30 p.m. And it also marks the beginning of the 3-week period that's going to culminate on Tisha B'Av, which will be in 3 weeks. And during this 3-week period, we don't do marriages, we don't do celebrations, we don't play music, we don't take haircuts, we don't purchase new things, new clothing, new homes, new cars. We don't purchase new things during these 3 weeks in order to mark the mourning for the temple and the fact that our temple was destroyed and we still live in exile. And really mourning for all the tragedies that Jews have experienced throughout our very, very long history. So, and then we will, it increases at the end of next week. We'll talk about it next week. And then it culminates in Tisha B'Av, which will be 3 weeks from today, another fast day, and where we, a 24-hour fast day, and a much more stringent fast day, which marks when the temple was destroyed. So that is what's special about today. Any questions? Nope. Okay, let's get straight to our topic. So today, because today is a fast day, we would talk about the mourning of for the various tragedies that happened to our people. Sad day. So I think it's important to share some of the sad events in our history. So I wanted to talk about the story of the Cantonists. It's a very, and it's, in Judaism in general, we don't obsess with tragedy. I think that's a mistake. The people that their Jewish identity is all about the Holocaust. We Jews don't obsess with tragedy. We don't live just focused on tragedy and thinking about tragedy. But we do also want to remember the tragedies. And so we have certain times a year, particularly these 3 weeks, which is a period for us to remember our tragic moments in our history. Of course, we had lots of positives in our history, and we try to focus on the good and focus on the positive. And even in the tragedies, we try to always find the silver linings in the positive stories. But we're going to focus today on the positives. But today we're going to focus on a tragic event in our history, which is the story of the Cantonists. So the story of the Cantonists is really a story that happened during The story of the Cantonists is really a story that happened during one of the worst periods in our long, difficult exile that we have had since the destruction of the temple around the year 70. And one of those worst periods was when Jews lived in the Russian Empire. Now, Jews were in the Russian Empire for a relatively brief period, about 145 years, from 1772 to 1917. It's a couple generations, but not, over the long scheme of 2,000 years. It was fairly short, but the horrors that we as Jews experienced in the Russian Empire remain in Jewish consciousness today, particularly because most Jews in the United States are descendants of Jews who lived in the Russian Empire. Almost all Jews in the United States are descendants of Jews that lived in the Russian Empire, and most of whom came to the United States in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, fleeing the Russian Empire. And so when we often speak of the horrors of life for Jews in Europe, in the shtetls, we're usually thinking of the horrors of the Russian Empire. And of course, the classic example is the Fiddler on the Roof movie, which captures just a small part of the horrors that Jews lived under within the Russian Empire. Now, during this period that Jews lived in the Russian Empire, during this 145-year period, the Jewish community in the Russian Empire was by far the largest Jewish community in the world. It was a tiny fraction of the overall population of the empire, which was very, very large. The Jews made up just a couple percent. They were very small within the empire, and they were one of countless ethnic and religious groups in the vast empire that included many Muslims, from Central Asia, from the Caucasus region, from the Buddhists from the Far East, and included many, many other peoples and religions. And Jews were only a very small part of that and one of many groups. However, Jews suffered uniquely in what was a horrible experience probably for most of the people in the empire, but Jews suffered uniquely. Among the horrors that Jews felt in the Russian Empire was, firstly, they were restricted to what was called the Pale of Settlement. There was a small area within the empire that Jews were allowed to live in, and they were not allowed to live beyond that pale. There were limits on occupations, where what jobs Jews were allowed to do. There were limits on travel. As a result, there was extreme poverty as a result of those limits. In general, the empire struggled and teetered, and in general, there was poverty throughout the empire. There was also official sanctioned violence at the hands of the government. In other words, in the empire, the police there were not your friends. They were there to hurt you, and Jews especially. And government officials were not there to help you. They were there to hurt you. They were your enemies. And there were also anti-Jewish riots that were often sanctioned by the government. And in fact, the Russian word for those riots, pogroms, has come into our language as anti-Jewish riots. And there were then also countless expulsions from different places that Jews did live. So these are all kind of part of the experience of Jews in the Russian Empire. I hope to one day do a class on the experience of Jews in the Russian Empire. Again, it had its silver linings, but it was a pretty horrific experience. But perhaps the worst of all these different terrible things that happened to Jews in the Russian Empire was the Cantonist decree, which has become etched in Jewish memory until today. Before I get to the Cantonist decree, just a little background of the Jews in the Russian Empire. So before 1772, Jews were not allowed to live in Russia. They lived, though, just west of Russia in a kingdom called Poland that had invited Jews to live there in the 14th century, and Jews had moved there in very, very, very large number. By the 16th century, Poland had the largest Jewish community in the world, and Jews had been living in Poland by 1772. Jews had been living in Poland for hundreds of years. Much of that time was positive, some of that time not so much. In 1772, and then later in 1795, Poland came under Russian rule. And along with that conquest of most of Poland, came 500,000 Jews who lived in Poland at that time. Now, the Russians had an official policy of anti-Semitism, and they didn't want Jews to join their military. By the way, Jews would start in 1795. There were about 500,000 Jews in the Russian Empire. 100 years later, by 1890, the Jews had increased due to natural increase and numbered about 5 million. So they grew very, very quickly in that time within the Russian Empire, remaining throughout that time the largest Jewish community in the world. Now, the Russians had an official policy of anti-Semitism. In many laws, many anti-Jewish laws that they enacted, part of that, they didn't want Jews in their military. They didn't trust Jews. And they thought very horribly of Jews, and they didn't want them in the military. And instead, they imposed a special tax on Jewish communities. In addition to regular taxes, the Jews had to pay a special tax in exchange for being released from military service. And yet, the Czars were looking both to persecute Jews as well as for ways to assimilate the Jewish community. Their goal was to make the entire Russian Empire Russian-speaking Orthodox Christians. That was their ultimate goal. And so to do that, they turned to a military draft. In the early 1800s, the draft was debated among Russian officials for years as a potential solution to what they called the Jewish problem. The problem that there were Jews in the Russian Empire. That phrase, by the way, would later be adopted in the 19th century by other anti-Semites. That phrase, the Jewish problem. Hitler, of course, decided that he had a solution to the Jewish problem, right? His final solution. But that was something that the Russians created, the Jewish problem. And the draft was repeatedly brought up, drafting Jews into the army. Now, in 1825, Tsar Alexander I was assassinated, and Tsar Nicholas I ascended to the throne. Nicholas was both ruthless. He crushed countless rebellions. He was a tyrant. He created a totalitarian state where the police had absolute control and a reign of terror. And he was also a rabid anti-Semite, absolutely hated Jews. And so he was determined to impose a draft on the Jewish community. That was despite a lot of Jewish lobbying of various officials and enormous bribes that were paid. A bribe of 200,000 rubles were paid to the person who was in charge of creating the draft law. But didn't help. In 1827, he signed a decree requiring the conscription of Jews to the army. However, the conscription of Jews required not that Jews must report for army service, but it required Jewish communities or kahals as they were called, in each town and city to present a certain percentage of the population annually for conscription to the army. At first, it was 4 men ages 12 to 25 per every 1,000 men of all ages. So if a town had 250 men of all ages, they would have to present 1 man annually ages 12 to 25. If they had 1,000 men, they'd have to present 4 men. If they had 10,000 men, they'd have to present 40 men to the draft. Now, if the men would be over 18, then they would have to serve 25 years in the army. The way the Russian military had always worked from ancient times was, unlike military as we think of today, where you serve in the military for a couple of years. In Russia, and this was true in much of Europe in the Middle Ages, but it was true in Russia even all the way through the 19th century. It was essentially a career. You were a career soldier. There was no such thing as just going for 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. You were a career soldier. It was 25 years. That was the minimum. And so if they were 18, they'd serve 25 years in the army. If they were younger than 18, they were sent to cantons, which were special military training camps. Essentially these kind of schools, training camps where they would serve, where they would go until they turned 18. And then once they turned 18, they would join the military and serve for 25 years. Yes?
They didn't count that time as...
No, before you were 18 did not count for the 25 years. So the earliest you could be released was when you were 43. The official Jewish community, the Kahal, was responsible to produce these conscripts and hand them over to military conscription centers. If the Kahal failed to bring the conscripts as required, there would be severe financial sanctions on the community and even criminal prosecution against the community leaders. So the local community leaders now found themselves in a terrible situation. They needed to produce soldiers, but no one wanted to go and serve. Who would want to go to such a service? Now, here was the challenge. They were able to provide adults to serve for 25 years, as opposed to kids who would have to go even younger. And as we'll see, it was even worse if they provided kids. However, in those days, most 18-year-old men were married. If a husband and father was sent to the military for 25 years, their wife and children had no means of support and would become themselves a community burden. So the community did not consider even the possibility of sending married men, particularly married men with children. Even if there were single young men, and there were some, they would likely not want to go to the army that had a horrible record in their treatment of Jews, and this is a 25-year commitment. Instead, the communities chose teens and even younger children to be taken to the military because they could not resist as easily. Now, how do you choose those people? So the truth is that long before the Russians had a conscription, the Austrian Empire already had a conscription of Jews, although it was significantly less anti-Semitic and less discriminatory, although it was also responsibility of the community. And the Chassam Sofer of Moshe Sofer wrote in a famous responsa to explain what the community should do, because they had no choice. They had to provide these conscription numbers, what they should do to choose whom they should choose. And he writes that it is wrong for communal leaders to choose on their own whom they feel should be sent. Rather, what they should do is they should exempt yeshiva students who are studying yeshiva from the draft, but all others should be put into a lottery and be chosen by lottery. He strongly opposed sending the poor, or even those that were irreligious, or those that were perhaps petty criminals. He opposed sending them to the draft, and the community essentially choosing who they thought was most worthy of, most deserving of being drafted. Rather, he said the best thing to do is to make a lottery. The Chassam Sofer's ruling was widely accepted by all rabbis at the time, and virtually all rabbis supported this approach. However, in reality, very few communities actually followed that. In reality, what happened is, in most communities, the leadership of the community exempted their own children. They were not going to send their own children. They also exempted the children of the wealthy people who were supporting the community. These were the people who were paying for the costs of the community. The communities at the time had extensive costs on education, in hospitals. They often had supporting the religious life, and so the communities had a lot of costs. The wealthy people were supporting those costs. They exempted their children from military service as well. They didn't want to get on their bad side and lose their support. So as a result, it was mostly the children of the poor who were taken. However, when time for conscription came for a particular community, what would happen is most of the children and young adults who were eligible would disappear. Their parents would send them into hiding, whether in other cities or other towns, or in hiding within their own town. And that made the role of the community in providing these conscripts very, very difficult. And this created an enormous amount of friction over who should be chosen and who could be and who should be taken. And this tore apart communities. Often what happened was people who were taken, whether by the community and handed over to the military conscription, often those people managed to escape and fled. The Russians, seeing a growing problem of people fleeing, they made a rule that for every person who flees, the community needs to supply 3 more conscripts. That didn't necessarily discourage people from fleeing. They still did, and then the problem fell on the community. The one thing that often did work was bribes. And Jews were very, very poor, but they scraped together whatever they could. They would often bribe military conscription officials once they were handed over to the military to declare them unfit to serve. In fact, a very significant percentage of Jews that were taken were found to be unfit to serve, more than is reasonable. And some even got the conscription officials to declare them dead. But even then, if the person brought was unfit to serve or dead, then somebody else had to be brought in their place. The community still had to fill their quotas. So understandably, this created huge battles between community members and community leaders, and between community members themselves over who should go, whose children should be taken. Yes?
Why didn't they send criminals?
The rabbis at the time, leading notably the Chassam Sofer, were very strongly opposed to that. It is forbidden to send criminals to challenging times where, as we'll see, there would be pressure to convert to Christianity, put under enormous pressure. You're not allowed to do that, even if someone's a criminal. You don't have the right to do that to someone.
That would have gotten them out of their communities.
Halachically, it is wrong to send them, even if they're a criminal, to put them in such a situation. The only way to do it, since they had absolutely no choice, was to do a lottery. And that was it. And the only people that should have been exempt, according to the Chassam Sofer, was active yeshiva students. Reality Almost no communities followed that. Now, since finding eligible children or young adults for the draft was so difficult, many communities resorted to hiring what was called chappers, or kidnappers. These were fellow Jews who would kidnap children off the street or from their homes in order to fill conscription quotas. Sometimes there were certain people designated already by the community, and they would go find them. Sometimes they would just take anyone random. The chappers were most often hired by the community. Sometimes, though, when someone's child was designated by the community to be taken, the parents would hire chappers to choose someone else's child in their child's place. And these chappers often took whatever children they could find, often taking children much younger than 12 and lying about the child's age. So children across Russia throughout this period lived in constant fear of these chappers. Chaim Meremzon, who was a Jewish Cantonist that wrote an autobiography, describes how he was 11 years old and he was on a Thursday afternoon going to the store to buy something for his mother, going to the grocery store, and he was grabbed by chappers. He also described how as the chappers rode him in a wagon, holding him down when he was tied down, they rode with him to their home, where they essentially where their staging place outside the town, in the middle of the forest. On the way, they stopped to recite their afternoon prayer. So these were religious Jews who were kidnappers for a living. Now, this got even worse. Remember, this started in 1827, and it continued for some 30 years. It got worse during the Crimean War in the early 1850s. Firstly, the quota was dramatically increased from 4 conscripts per 1,000 men to 10 conscripts per 1,000 men. So it was increased dramatically. The community had a very hard time filling these quotas. But then the Czar also, during the Crimean War, allowed for the conscripts in each community. Until then, conscripts had to be a resident of that community. So essentially, chappers would kidnap children within their own community. But now, during the Crimean War, when the quotas were increased and communities were unable to fill them, the government allowed any community to provide children from any other community. And that now allowed communities to hire chappers to go to other communities and grab children, making it much, much, much worse. Chappers were all over the place, grabbing children. There were often rumors. So rumor would come that there's a chapper in town, and all the children would go into hiding. People describe how in the middle of their Shabbos prayers, someone said chappers are in town, and all the children would flee and find somewhere to hide, run out of shul and find somewhere to hide. And there are countless descriptions of this. And so understandably, the fact that the community hired these chappers did not endear them to community members. In fact, this led to this requirement of the community, and these battles within communities over whose children should go led to a total breakdown of Jewish community life in the Russian Empire. And in the 1840s, it led to the official dissolution of the community, where the Kahal was officially dissolved. As a result, without the Kahal, the Czar instead had each town, the leaders of each town, the mayors of each town, appoint Jews within their town to be responsible for the draft from that town. So rather than being elected leaders of the community, they were now just appointed by the Russians, which made the relationship between these people responsible for the draft and their fellow Jews even worse. So what happened to the people who were taken? So the children who were under 18 were sent to youth military training camps called cantons, which had long been a part of the Russian army. There were families, often There were military families where the fathers were soldiers. They would send their children to these cantons. It was also used for orphans were often sent to these cantons. And so these cantons, these military training camps, they had the Jewish children were being sent there. Often they were beaten and abused in these schools and treated as soldiers, so treated very roughly. But they also, and remember, some of these children were as young as 7 or 8 years old. They also went to school there. They got basic military training in these schools. They were particularly focused on marching because the Russian military was obsessed with marching. They were always marching. Many children died on the way to these camps. Many of the camps were far. Many of the camps were in Siberia, in other faraway places. So children often died in the long treks to these camps, which they often went by foot. Once in the camps, their leaders and teachers were under orders to try to get the children to convert to Orthodox Christianity. Despite the pressure, the vast majority of kids, many of them very, very young, refused to convert. And until 1843, less than 20% of the children converted. The Czar then expressed frustration by the slow pace of conversion and ordered that pressure be increased and insisted that the leadership of these camps, these training camps, report how many children were baptized and were under regular pressure to produce a certain number of baptisms. This led to beatings, tortures, and countless forced conversions over the coming years. Even then, even with countless beatings, tortures, kids being killed because they were refusing, even then, only about a third of the Cantonists converted. While 2/3 of them withstood the beatings and tortures, and these are kids, right? Withstood the beatings and tortures. Many died from them, but many of them survived and remained Jewish. Even those that did convert, these forced conversions, most continued to keep Jewish law, although they were officially Christian, and many later would petition the government for permission to return to Judaism as adults. Unfortunately, the Russians didn't generally allow for that. Now, the Jewish community itself went to great lengths to keep in contact with the Cantonists. They tried to provide kosher to the Cantonists. They tried to provide their Jewish needs for them. They even sent rabbis to the cantons for the holidays to lead the prayers. And they were able to do this by extensively bribing local officials, which was a way to get around most problems in Russia. They did by bribing local officials. So that's why the period and this whole process of drafting Jews to the Russian military during this period became known as the Cantonist decrees, because majority of those taken were children and ended up in these cantons. And what happened as a result is that all the Jewish soldiers became known as Cantonists. Now, those that were taken as adults, and many, a significant percentage were taken as adults, they went straight to join the army. They were also abused and mistreated in the army as Jews. The same for the Cantonists. Once they came of age, they had to join the army for 25 years. A Jew could never become an officer. So they would serve 25 years. Originally it was 25 years, later was lowered to 20 years as low-level soldiers. There were only a handful of exceptions of Jews who became low-level officers. But generally, they remained privates or sergeants their entire career. They could not be promoted because they were Jewish. They continued to observe Judaism as best as they could. It was difficult, often with the help of local communities where they were. Some were stationed near local communities, although many were not. In places where there were no local communities, they brought in rabbis to where they were stationed. At one point, however, Tsar Nicholas, remember he was a rabid anti-Semite, heard that there were rabbis employed in the military to help serve Jewish soldiers, and they had presumably bribed and convinced various Russian military officials to allow rabbis to serve the soldiers, just as there were priests. And when the Tsar heard that, he flew into a rage and ordered all the rabbis be immediately fired and no rabbis be allowed in his army, in his military. But most of the Jewish soldiers remained observant, and many served with distinction, particularly in the Crimean War. In 1856, Tsar Nicholas died. 1 year later, in 1857, his successor, Alexander II, abolished the Cantonist decree. Children could no longer be taken as conscripted as soldiers. Furthermore, all children that were Jewish children in these cantons that had been conscripted, who had not yet converted, would be able to go home. However, those who did convert had to stay, could not go back to Jewish families and go back to Judaism, because from a Russian church perspective, they now belong to the church. So they had to stay, but those who had not converted were able to go home. However, those that were already in the military had to serve out their 20-year term. So there were still Cantonists in the military for at least another 20 years. However, instead of the Cantonist rules that they had until now, under the new rules, Jews would serve in the military like everybody else. When they came of age, there would be a lottery among all eligible men of all ethnicities and all religions, who would then serve, and then they also stopped the 20 years of service, and it went down to first to 5 years, and then it changed different numbers, but they would serve for a much more limited number of years, similar to a regular conscription, as we would see in any as we'd see in many countries today. So Jews did continue to serve in the military after 1857. However, it was not a discriminatory way. It was in similar numbers, same numbers as the general population, and there was still discrimination in the military against Jews, but it was not a discriminatory way. Children were no longer taken, and most importantly, it was no longer a communal responsibility. It was not the problem of the community. It was each individual directly working with the government. If you could figure out a way to get out of military service, and many Jews did, then you could, but often through bribes. That's the way they did it. But countless Jews served in the military throughout, similar to their numbers in the general population. Unfortunately, Jews would continue to suffer in the Russian Empire over the coming years, although the Cantonist decree was over until the Russian Empire fell in 1917. So that's the story in short of the Cantonists. But the Cantonists, although the story itself didn't impact that many people, there's various estimates, but there were probably total between 50 and 70,000 Cantonists. Over a 30-year period from 1827 to 1857. So it wasn't that many overall. It was a relatively small percentage, 0.4%, and then later 0.1% of the population. It was pretty small when you think about it. Of them, about a little more than half probably were in the cantons. In other words, were taken as children. Or maybe 2/3. There's some debate about the numbers. The records aren't great. It was all a mess back then. But the impact was very, very severe. Firstly, the impact destroyed the Jewish community, the internal Jewish community. Before that, Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, had been extremely well organized, had very, very strong communal structures. This totally destroyed the communal structures. The communal leaders, almost without exception, all had abandoned their own community, mistreated their own community by, on their own, choosing whom they felt should be taken, choosing young children, sending out kidnappers, to kidnap children, and this was done in almost every single community. Very few communities did it fairly with a lottery, and so as a result, almost every it created enormous friction between the leadership and members of the community, between members of the community, and it really served to destroy the Jewish communal structure in Eastern Europe. And it never really recovered in modern times. And even today, we in this country, where most Jews are descendants of Russian Jews, we never really built community structures in the same way with the same authority as they had once had, very, very much as a result of this breakdown in communal leadership then during the Cantonist decrees. It also, though, helped bring tens of thousands of Jews into the military. And those soldiers that served first as Cantonists, but then also the same applied for soldiers later, those that did serve in the military till their full terms, were accepted from certain anti-Jewish laws. And the most notable one was that they were allowed to live anywhere in the Russian Empire. And this led to many Jews moving outside the Pale of Settlement. And most of the early communities outside the Pale of Settlement in Moscow and St. Petersburg and even in the East and in southern Russia, most of these communities began as military communities, communities of Cantonists or Cantonist communities. And that from once they retired, many of these soldiers, once they retired, they are now in their 40s. Many of them, surprisingly, as surprising as it might be, many of them married Jewish women, got married, and had children, raised families, built communities, had careers, even though they were starting quite late in life. And many people today are descendants of these Cantonists. So they did help build the Jewish community, essentially, outside of the Pale of Settlement as a result. And it grew over the years as there were more and more soldiers serving in the military over the years. And now, we don't know why Hashem would have done such a thing, given such a terrible decree to the communities, and why the communities failed so horribly at responding to the decree, as Jewish leaders would do later. And when appointed by the Nazis, the Jewish councils that the Nazis created and others, Jews often abandoned their own people, Jewish leaders. So it's a story throughout our history. We don't know why. However, when the Cantonist decree was first came about in 1827, at the time, the leader of Chabad was Reb Dov Ber, known as the Mittler Rebbe. He was the leader of the Chabad movement at the time. And he was very, very distressed over this decree. And he actually traveled to his father's grave in the town of Hadich to pray, ask his father, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, to intercede with Hashem to help him revoke this decree. And on his way to Hadich, he actually got sick and he died. He was fairly young, in his early 50s. However, before he got sick, he actually gave a talk where he spoke about why Hashem would do such a thing. Why would he require Jews to be taken to the military in such a horrible way where they would try to force them to convert out of Judaism? And he explained something very interesting. He said that Hashem gives us many commandments that we're supposed to fulfill. But what happens is, over time, those commandments kind of become our second nature. They become part of what we do. And we don't pay much attention to them. We don't do them with purpose, with meaning, with intent. They become what the Talmud calls mitzvahs anashim milamoda, things that are just done out of habit. And they just become part of the habit, and people just get stuck in the habit. And they never becomes meaningful. And so what happens is, from time to time, Hashem then places Jews in terrible situations where they are forced to sacrifice for their Judaism. And then they are required to recognize to themselves, admit to themselves that they don't, that they're not fulfilling the commandments just because of their habit, just because that's the way they were raised, but this is something that they really believe in and they're really ready to sacrifice for. And that is why Hashem places people in these kinds of situations. And indeed, The Cantonists were the first ones in relatively modern times. In medieval times, of course, Jews always faced the threat of being killed or converting, but the Cantonists were young children, tens of thousands of them, who faced the extreme torture and abuse if they did not convert to Christianity, and many of them suffered extreme torture and abuse and were stubborn. Most of them, the vast majority, were stubborn and refused to convert, despite the torture and abuse that they suffered. And it really was the beginning of what we call in Hebrew Mesirat Nefesh, a sacrifice for Judaism in modern times. And they really showed this sacrifice, and this would be a sacrifice that would later continue, because generations later, in 1917, the Communists would take control of the Russian Empire, and in the Soviet Union, Jews would once again need to sacrifice for Judaism. And that sacrifice for Judaism really came out in a very powerful way as a result of this Cantonist decree. And of course, it was still a horrific thing, and still a terrible thing, and people were glad when it was over, but it did bring out, in a way, the best within the Jewish people, even within young children, their ability to sacrifice for Judaism, something that Jews have done for generations. So that's the story of the Cantonists. We'll be back next week with breakfast, hopefully with another crowd. I forget our topic for next week will be, I'll tell you right now, our topic for next week will be building the second temple.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Otherwise, I would have spoken to an empty room.
We don't mind a private class.
No, that's beautiful.
Yes.
Thank you.
We don't mind at all.
Yeah.
So next week there's breakfast, but the week after that there's
No,
breakfast.
the next 2 weeks there is breakfast.
Oh, okay.
No, Tisha B'Av's in 3 weeks.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Next 2 weeks there is
I took
breakfast.
one for Eric.
Excellent. Thank you.
And there was